Hey Nightscapers, welcome back. In the last units we prepared everything we needed for our astrophoto shoot. You should have a date and location picked out, and you should also have your gear packed up and ready to go. My recommendation is to arrive at your location well before sunset. This will give you the time to explore the area and pre-visualize where you'll be shooting your astrophotos. Right before sunset is a good time to briefly open up your star chart app to determine the direction the Milky Way will be in the sky once it gets dark. Recall the constellations that you took note of while you were planning with Stellarium. As it gets dark, there are a few things that you can do to help preserve your night vision and give you the best possible view of the stars. Reduce your camera and smartphone screen brightnesses, and consider switching your headlamp to its red night vision mode. As the stars start to appear in the sky, use your smartphone app to determine what constellations you're looking at and try to locate the constellations that you took note of when planning. If you don't have a smartphone available, just give your eyes some time to adjust to the darkness and find the parts of the sky that seem to have the most stars. If you picked a good spot, you should be able to find the Milky Way with your naked eyes. Once you know where to point your camera, it's time to set up your tripod. When setting up the tripod, consider deploying it in a way that gives you the most stability and the best perspective to frame both your landscape and the part of the night sky with the Milky Way. Many tripods allow you to unlock and change the angle of the legs so that you can deploy them closer to the ground for stability. If you have slightly windy conditions, you might also need to tie your camera strap to the center column, or even remove the strap altogether. If you're still having trouble with stability and your tripod has a hook on it, consider hanging a mass of some kind, like your camera bag, from the center column of the tripod. Finally, let's go through our camera menus to select the best settings for shooting astrophotos. I recommend double checking these settings in order to get the best results. It's no fun when you realize that you spent your entire night shooting in small compressed JPEG mode instead of RAW. First, set your camera to manual exposure mode. This will allow us to set the shutter speed, the aperture, and the ISO. Next, enable RAW recording mode. Astrophotos usually require some post-processing in the computer, and will need to preserve as much of the image data as possible for the best results. JPEG is usually much more difficult to make large adjustments with in post-processing. Next, enable manual focus on your lens. It's nearly impossible to autofocus on the stars, so we'll need to focus manually. I also recommend setting the focus ring roughly to infinity. If your lens doesn't have distance marks for the focusing scale, you can usually just rotate your focusing ring all the way in and then just a touch back to get it close to infinity. Next, activate the self-timer mode. This will give a couple seconds delay before the shutter opens to allow any vibrations in the camera and tripod to settle. You can also use a remote trigger or intervalometer to trigger your camera and prevent vibration. Next, set your white balance to auto or AWB. The night sky has a whole range of colors, and they vary greatly depending on the amount of light pollution or moonlight. And since we're shooting in RAW mode, we can actually change the white balance of the image in the computer later. Next, enable long exposure noise reduction. Most modern SLRs have this feature, but it might be hidden deep in the camera's menus. If you're unsure of where to find it, refer to your camera's instruction manual. Long exposure noise reduction reduces noise in your astrophotos by taking two photographs, a normal exposure, and then a second exposure where the camera doesn't open the shutter. Since this second dark frame contains only noise and no image, it can be subtracted from the normal exposure to create a final noise-reduced image. It usually creates much better results, but at the cost of processing time. For example, if you use long exposure noise reduction on a 30-second exposure, you'll have to wait a full minute before you can touch your camera again, 30 seconds for the normal exposure and another 30 seconds for the dark frame. Finally, if your camera supports it, enable live view mode. This will flip up the mirror of the camera, open the shutter, and allow us to use the camera's LCD to focus on the stars. That covers the most important things to set up before you start making your first exposures. To double check, we set the camera to manual mode, enabled RAW recording, we set the lens to manual focus and focused at infinity. We activated the self-timer mode. We set the white balance to auto. We enabled long exposure noise reduction, and we activated live view mode. Now that your camera's all set up, let's make our first exposures in the next video lesson.